Danger might be closer than you think. Before we begin, like this video, comment where and what time you're watching from, and subscribe for more chilling stories. Now turn off the lights, get comfortable, and let's dive into the unknown. Never thought I'd be the type of person to post in a forum like this, but after what happened last summer, I need to get this off my chest. My name is Lisa. I'm 34, and I work as a nurse in a busy emergency ward. Last year was hell. Long shifts, constant stress, patients dying alone because of hospital restrictions. I was burned out in a way I didn't even recognize until my supervisor suggested I take time off. So, I did something I hadn't done in years. I packed up my gear, loaded my car, and drove to Trinity Alps for a solo camping trip. I needed silence. I needed to be away from the noise, the beeping monitors, the fluorescent lights. Just me, the trees, and the sound of the creek running beside my tent. I chose a spot near Canyon Creek Lakes, not too far off the main trail, but secluded enough that I wouldn't have to deal with crowds. It was late afternoon when I got there, and I took my time setting up. Tent, camp stove, bear bag hanging from a high branch. I had done this a dozen times before, and I wasn't scared. The forest felt alive in the way it always does. Branches swaying in the wind, the distant call of a hawk. As the sun dipped behind the mountains, I made dinner, drank some tea, and sat by the creek, letting the exhaustion of the past year melt away. It felt good, peaceful. I fell asleep easily that night, cocooned in my sleeping bag, listening to the faint rustle of leaves outside my tent. Then, around 2 a.m., I woke up. I didn't know why at first. There was no loud noise, no sudden movement, just that prickling feeling, the one that makes the hair on your arms stand up. I lay still, listening, and that's when I heard it. Footsteps, not the scampering of a raccoon or the heavy plod of a deer. These were careful, slow, circling my tent. I held my breath, my heart hammering in my chest. Every instinct told me not to move. I don't know how long I lay there, frozen, but eventually the footsteps stopped. I waited, straining my ears, but there was nothing, just the wind through the trees. After what felt like forever, I convinced myself I had imagined it, maybe half dreamed it. By morning, the night before felt distant, like a trick of my own paranoia. But when I stepped outside, something was wrong. My bear bag, which I had tied securely to a high branch, was on the ground. The rope had been cleanly cut, not chewed, not broken, sliced. My food was scattered, some of it missing. My gut twisted. Animals don't use knives. I looked around for tracks, expecting to see a raccoon's tiny prints or maybe a bear's heavy paws. Instead, I found something worse. Bare footprints, human, muddy, leading away from my campsite into the woods. But about 10 feet in, they just stopped, as if whoever made them had simply vanished. I stood there for a long time, staring at where the footprints ended. The rational part of my brain tried to make sense of it. Maybe the ground had dried up. Maybe they'd walked on rocks after that. But the dirt was damp, soft. It should have held tracks longer. I felt exposed, like I was being watched. I scanned the trees, half expecting to see someone standing there, hidden in the branches. But there was nothing, no movement, no sound except for the creek gurgling behind me. My gut told me to pack up and leave, but I pushed the thought away. I was being ridiculous. This was probably some weird hiker prank, right? People left carved symbols and weird rock stacks on trails all the time. Maybe this was just some idiot trying to scare campers. I forced myself to eat breakfast, shaking off the unease. Still, I couldn't stop thinking about it. As I hiked a few miles down the trail later that morning, the trees felt different, like they were pressing in closer, like the space between them was smaller than before. I didn't pass a single person, which was strange for such a popular area. Even the birds seemed quieter. The only sound was my own breathing, and the crunch of my boots on the dirt. I tried to focus on the beauty of the place, but every time I looked over my shoulder, I felt that same creeping sensation that I wasn't alone, that someone was just out of sight, watching me. I told myself I was being paranoid. I even said it out loud at one point, just to break the silence. But my voice sounded wrong out here, too loud, like the trees were swallowing the sound before it could reach anything else. By the time I made it back to camp, the sun was already low. I decided to turn in early. I'd had, enough weirdness for one day. I made sure my bear bag was secure this time, zipped myself inside my tent, and forced myself to sleep. But at exactly 2 a.m. I woke up again. The same feeling, that static electricity charge in the air. And then, the footsteps. Closer this time. Slower, deliberate. My mouth went dry. My hands clenched into fists inside my sleeping bag. I listened as the steps circled my tent once, twice, and then stopped right at the entrance. The fabric of the tent shifted. Barely, but enough that I saw it. A shadow. Tall, motionless. Someone was standing right outside. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. I just lay there, every muscle locked in place. The shadow didn't move either. Just stood there. I didn't hear breathing. No rustling, no shifting, just presence. I don't know how long I lay there, but eventually my body started shaking. Not from cold, but from sheer adrenaline. Then in the silence, I heard something that still makes my stomach turn when I think about it. A whisper, not words, not a voice I recognized. Just a breathy, low sound right outside my tent. That was it. I snapped. I fumbled for the knife I kept near my sleeping bag, and in one motion I unzipped the tent and lunged out, my flashlight in one hand, knife in the other. There was nothing there. My flashlight cut through the dark, bouncing off the trees, the creek, the damp earth. The night was still, unnervingly quiet, as if the forest itself had been holding its breath. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I spun in every direction, expecting to see someone darting into the trees, but there was no one. No footprints, no signs of movement, nothing. And yet I knew. I wasn't alone. My instincts were screaming at me, my body telling me to run. I backed toward my tent, the beam of my flashlight shaking in my hand. That's when I saw it. On the tree right next to my tent, something was carved into the bark. Deep, jagged slashes, as if made in a hurry. A spiral. Not perfect, not symmetrical, erratic. It hadn't been there when I set up camp. My stomach twisted into knots. I suddenly felt lightheaded, dizzy, like the world had tilted slightly off center. I don't remember making the decision. I just remember throwing my gear into my pack, leaving my tent behind, and getting the hell out of there. I hiked through the dark, barely stopping to breathe. I didn't care if I tripped, if I got lost. I just needed to leave. My flashlight flickered as, I reached the trailhead, but I didn't stop running until I was back at my car. The moment I locked the doors, my whole body gave out. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the keys into the ignition. When the engine finally roared to life, I checked my phone. 2:47 a.m. Less than an hour since I woke up, but it felt like an eternity. I sped down the empty road, not daring to look in my rearview mirror. I didn't stop until I hit a gas station miles away, where I finally allowed myself to breathe. I didn't sleep that night. I didn't even turn off the car. I just sat there, staring at the windshield, waiting for the sun to come up. I never reported it. What would I even say? There was no proof, no signs of another person, but I know what I heard, what I felt. Something was there with me that night, and the worst part? I still don't know what it wanted. I haven't been camping since. I still love the outdoors, but now every time I step into the woods I get that feeling again. The one I had that night in Trinity Alps, that someone is watching, waiting. Story 2. I've been a truck driver for almost 15 years, and I've seen my share of weird things on the road, freak accidents, strange people, even the occasional UFO story from other drivers at truck stops. But nothing has ever messed with me like what happened last summer on Route 190 through Death Valley. I wasn't going to share this because, honestly, I still don't understand what the hell happened. But I figure if anyone's going to believe me, it's people on a forum like this. It was mid-July. The kind of heat that turns the asphalt into a shimmering mirage. I was hauling a load of produce from Bakersfield to Las Vegas, pushing through the last stretch before stopping for the night. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, leaving that eerie pink-orange glow over the desert. That's when I saw him, a man walking alone on the side of the highway. No car in sight, no backpack, nothing. Just a tall, thin guy in a dirty button-up and jeans walking like he had nowhere to be. Normally I don't pick up hitchhikers, but something about him, I don't know. Maybe it was the way he looked. Not desperate, not lost, just out of place. I pulled over, rolled down the window, and leaned out. "You need a ride?" I asked. The guy didn't answer at first. He just stood there, staring at the truck like he wasn't expecting anyone to actually stop. Up close, I noticed his skin looked pale, almost grayish, like he'd been out in the sun too long. His eyes were sunken, shadowed in a way that didn't quite match the light. Finally, he nodded and climbed in without a word. The cab filled with the smell of dry sweat and dust. I don't know why, but the air felt heavier the second he shut the door. I tried to make small talk, the way I usually do with passengers, but the guy wasn't having it. No name, no explanation, nothing. He just sat there, stiff, staring straight ahead. After a few minutes, I gave up and turned the radio on. Static. Every station. Which was weird because I'd just been listening to a classic rock station 15 minutes before. I flicked it off, uncomfortable with the silence. But the longer we drove, the more something started nagging at me. I glanced at him from the corner of my eye, and that's when it hit me. His shirt. It was buttoned wrong. Not just a little. The whole thing was misaligned, like he'd put it on in a hurry or wasn't used to wearing clothes. I don't know why, but that detail stuck with me. Something about it felt off, like he had dressed himself without really understanding how clothes were supposed to work. I kept my hands on the wheel, my gut telling me I'd made a mistake picking him up. But I reminded myself that people get weird when they're dehydrated. Maybe he'd been out in the sun too long. Maybe he was in shock. I told myself I was overthinking it. But then, a few miles down the road, he spoke for the first time. "This road," he said, his voice low and dry like he hadn't used it in years. "Where does it go?" That made me pause. Who the hell hitchhikes without knowing where they're going? "Vegas," I said slowly, glancing at him. "You headed that way?" He didn't answer, just kept staring straight ahead. His hands were resting on his knees, fingers twitching every few seconds, like he was trying to remember how to move them. The air in the cab felt wrong, thick, heavy, the kind of feeling you get in a room after a bad argument, like something had settled in that you couldn't see. My stomach twisted, and for the first time in years I felt genuinely uneasy in my own truck. That's when I realized something that damn near made my skin crawl. His shoes were clean. I mean pristine. Not a speck of dust, not a scuff mark, not even the faintest sign that he had been walking along the hot desert road. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, trying to stay calm. This doesn't make sense. The thought looped over and over in my head. Where the hell did this guy come from? My skin was crawling at this point. I've picked up all kinds of people on the road. Drifters, runaway teens, lost hikers, but none of them ever felt like this. Every instinct in me was screaming that something was wrong, but I couldn't just pull over and tell him to get out. Not in the middle of nowhere. Not with the sun completely gone and nothing but darkness stretching for miles. So, I did the next best thing. I told him I needed to stop for gas. A station. Came up about 10 miles down the road. One of those rundown places with flickering lights and an old vending machine outside. I pulled in, put the truck in park, and turned to him. "Gonna grab a drink. You want anything?" He just shook his head, slow and deliberate. "Fine by me." I got out, shut the door behind me, and walked inside, breathing deep for the first time in an hour. The air conditioning hit me like a slap, and for a moment I felt stupid. Maybe I was just tired. Maybe the heat was getting to me. But then, as I was paying for a bottle of water, the cashier, a wiry old guy with sun-leathered skin, nodded toward my truck. "That your rig?" I glanced back at it through the window. "Yeah." He squinted. "You got a passenger?" My stomach dropped. "Yeah." "Why?" The old man frowned. "'Cause I've been watching since you pulled up. You got out alone." I swear the world tilted under me. My hands went cold. No, that's not right." I turned so fast I nearly knocked over a rack of snacks. The truck was sitting there, door shut, cab light on. I should have been able to see the hitchhiker inside, but the seat? It was empty. I ran outside, yanked open the passenger door. Nothing. No marks on the seat. No footprints in the dust outside the truck. Just gone. Like he was never there. My hands shook as I climbed back into the cab. I forced myself to breathe, my head spinning. Maybe he ran off. Maybe he snuck out while I was inside. but the doors were locked. I knew because I had locked them myself out of habit. That's when I had one last horrible thought. I reached for my dash cam. My fingers felt numb as I scrolled through the footage. I rewound to where I pulled over on the highway. The footage was crystal clear. I could see my truck, the empty road, the desert stretching into nothing. I saw myself lean out of the driver's side window, talking to no one. I saw the passenger door open on its own. I saw myself talking, nodding like I was hearing answers that weren't there. I kept watching, my breath shallow, as the truck rolled down the highway with just me inside. I haven't picked up a hitchhiker since, and I sure as hell don't drive through Death Valley at night anymore. Story 3. We weren't supposed to split up. That was the one rule we had. No one goes anywhere alone. It wasn't even about safety, really. It was more about the kind of stupid dares that happen on camping trips. The kind where someone wanders off at night just to scare the rest of us. We were too old for that shit. Or at least I thought we were. But that was before Matt disappeared. Before we woke up and he was just gone. It was last September, right before the weather started turning cold. Me, Matt, Jake, and Serena had planned this trip for months. A weekend in Big Sur, camping right on the cliffs with a view of the ocean. Matt was the one who found the spot. He was always that guy. The one who knew the best hidden campsites. The one who could start a fire in the rain. The one who convinced you that the extra 5-mile hike would be worth it. And honestly, it usually was. But that Friday night, something about the place felt wrong. At first, I thought it was just me. The drive-in had been quiet. Too quiet. We didn't pass a single car for miles. When we finally pulled off the road, the campsite was beautiful, sure, but something about it felt empty in a way I couldn't explain. Like we weren't supposed to be there. Jake joked that we had the whole place to ourselves, but I saw the way Serena kept glancing over her shoulder, like she was expecting to see someone standing at the tree line. Matt, of course, brushed it off. "It's perfect," he said, flashing that cocky grin. No noise, no people, just us and the ocean. That first night, we built a fire, drank a little, told dumb stories. It almost felt normal, almost. But every time the wind died down, I thought I could hear something else. Not waves, not rustling leaves. Something further away. A low, drawn-out sound like a voice, but stretched too thin. At one point, I turned to Matt. "Do you hear that?" He paused, listening, and then he just grinned, shaking his head. "Man, you're just drunk." I wanted to believe him. I really did. But even after we put out the fire and crawled into our tents, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I lay there, staring at the fabric of my tent, listening. The wind had picked up, making the trees creak and groan. But underneath it, I still swore I heard something else. A distant humming, faint but steady. Almost like a song, but the notes were all wrong. Too slow, too deliberate. I thought about waking Jake or Serena, but I didn't want to sound crazy. Instead, I pulled my sleeping bag tighter around me and forced myself to close my eyes. When I woke up, the world felt different. The air was too still, like the whole forest was holding its breath. I unzipped my tent and stepped outside, and that's when I realized something was wrong. The fire pit was cold, too cold, like it had been out for hours. My stomach tightened. I turned toward Matt's tent. It was open, unzipped halfway, the flap swaying slightly in the breeze. His sleeping bag was inside, messy, like he had gotten up in a hurry. But Matt was gone. At first, we weren't panicked. Not really. We figured he went to take a piss, maybe went down to the cliffs to get a better view of the sunrise. But as the minutes stretched into an hour, unease started, creeping in. His boots were still at the campsite. His phone was still in the car. He hadn't just wandered off. He left with nothing. We called his name over and over, our voices swallowed by the wind. We walked the trails, checked the beach below the cliffs. Nothing. No footprints, no signs of a struggle. It was like he had just vanished. And then my phone buzzed. It was a message from Matt's number. "I'm fine. Don't look for me." My hands went ice cold. I turned to Jake and Serena, holding up phone. "Did either of you text him?" They shook their heads. Serena's face had gone pale. "His phone's still in the car," she whispered. I don't remember who moved first. Maybe it was Jake, maybe it was me. But within seconds we were running to the car. Serena fumbled with the door handle, yanking it open so fast she nearly tripped. And there it was, Matt's phone, right where we left it, face down on the passenger seat. I grabbed it, my hands shaking, and pressed the power button. The lock, screen lit up, no new messages, nothing sent, nothing received, just the same battery percentage as the night before, like it hadn't been touched. Jake took a deep breath, trying to stay logical. Maybe there's another phone. Maybe he had a second one. But even as he said it, I could see in his face that he didn't believe it. We knew Matt. He wasn't the kind of guy to just leave. And if he had, he wouldn't have left his boots. He wouldn't have texted from a phone that wasn't even on. Serena was the one who noticed it first. The footprints, leading away from the car, down toward the cliffs. Bare footprints. No shoes, no socks. Just the outline of naked feet in the dirt. Too far apart, like whoever made them wasn't just walking. They were moving fast. We followed them without speaking, our breath coming in short, shallow gasps. And then, they stopped. Just like that. 10 feet from the edge of the cliff. Gone. We called the cops. They searched the area, questioned us, checked phone records. Nothing. No signs of Matt. No logical explanation for the text. No leads. They said it looked like he fell, that he got disoriented, walked too close to the edge. But there was no body, no broken branches, no disturbance in the brush. Just absence. His case is still open. His parents still put up flyers every few months. But me? I know we're never going to find him. Because that wasn't Matt who texted us. It couldn't have been. And if it was, then whatever answered us that morning, it wasn't human anymore. Story 4. Chris and I weren't planning on stopping for the night. We had a schedule. We were supposed to push through to Flagstaff, where we had a cheap motel booked. Nothing fancy. Just a place to crash before the next leg of our road trip. But somewhere along Highway 62, deep in the Mojave, I started getting a bad headache. One of those pulsing, behind-the-eyes migraines that makes you feel like you're underwater. I told Chris I needed to stop, just for a few hours, just to rest my eyes. He didn't argue. He was tired too. That's when we saw it. The Hilltop Inn, a squat, single-story motel just off the road, the kind you'd picture in a crime documentary. Peeling white paint, flickering neon vacancy sign, a gravel lot with exactly one other car parked outside. I don't even remember seeing an exit sign or any indication that a motel should even be out here. But there it was, sitting in the middle of the desert, waiting for us. The lobby was strange. Too clean, too quiet. The air smelled like lemon-scented cleaner, but there was no dust. No fingerprints on the front desk. No signs of use. Like it had just been scrubbed down for the first time in years. The woman at the desk looked up when we walked in. Late 50s, heavy makeup, but her expression was completely blank. Not unfriendly, just off. "Room for two?" she asked, like she was already expecting us. Chris paid in cash. The woman handed us a key. A real key, not a card. Room 5. We thanked her, but she didn't respond. Just watched us as we walked out the door. When I glanced back, she was still staring, her eyes too wide, too unblinking. The room was exactly what you'd expect from a roadside motel. Dim lighting, outdated floral bedspread, the TV that looked like it hadn't been turned on in a decade. But something about it felt wrong. I don't mean dirty or creepy, just off. The air was stale, like no one had been in there for a long time. There were no scuff marks on the floor, no dents in the pillows, no tiny imperfections that come from people passing through. It was as if the room had been set up rather than used. I told myself I was just overtired. Chris took off his shoes and collapsed onto the bed, mumbling something about setting an alarm. I sat on the edge of mine, rubbing my temples, trying to shake off the lingering headache. That's when I noticed the voices, muffled, coming from the room next door. Not loud, just a low murmur, like someone having a quiet conversation. I couldn't make out the words, but there was something wrong about the rhythm. Too steady. No pauses, no change in tone. Just constant. Chris was half asleep already, so I got up and pressed my ear to the wall. The voices didn't sound normal. They weren't arguing, they weren't laughing, they were just talking. A never-ending stream of words, like a radio left on in another language. I pulled away, shivering. My stomach felt tight. There was only one other car in the lot when we arrived. If that room was occupied, wouldn't we have seen someone? I walked to the window, peeking through the curtain at the parking lot outside. The car was gone. I froze. My mind immediately started trying to rationalize it. Maybe the car belonged to the motel owner. Maybe someone else checked in late. But deep down, I knew that wasn't right. The road outside was empty. There were no headlights, no engine sounds, no sign that anyone had left. Just absence. And yet, the voices next door kept going, steady and unbroken. I turned back to Chris, my pulse hammering in my throat. "Hey," I whispered, shaking his shoulder. "Wake up." He groaned but barely stirred. I tried again, more urgent this time. "Chris, something's wrong." Before he could respond, someone knocked on our door. It wasn't loud, just a single soft tap. Chris sat up groggily, rubbing his eyes. "What?" he mumbled. I put a finger to my lips, shaking my head. "Don't answer it." We both sat there, staring at the door, listening. Nothing. No footsteps walking away, no second knock. Just the same steady hum of voices through the wall. My skin crawled. I had the overwhelming sense that if we opened that door, something terrible would be waiting on the other side. I don't know how long we sat there, but eventually I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my bag, yanked Chris to his feet, and said, "We're leaving. Now." We didn't pack, didn't check out. We just ran. The lobby was empty. No woman at the front desk. The neon vacancy sign was off. When we got to the car, I had this horrible feeling that if I turned around, the motel wouldn't be there anymore. I didn't look, I just drove. We didn't talk about it for hours. When we finally stopped at a gas station, Chris turned to me and said, "That place, it didn't feel real." And he was right. When we checked our phones later, there was no record of the Hilltop Inn. No listing, no reviews, no sign it had ever existed. But the worst part? Later that night, as I was falling asleep in a normal, real motel, I swore I heard it again. That same muffled voice. Somewhere. Close. Story 5. I spend a lot of time alone in the wilderness. Comes with the job. I'm a wildlife photographer. And over the years, I've camped in some of the most remote places you can imagine. I'm used to silence. I'm used to isolation. But there was something about that cabin. Something I can't explain. This happened last October in the Sierra Nevada. I had been hiking for 2 days, tracking a herd of mule deer for a project I was working on. The weather was perfect. Crisp, cool, the kind of autumn air that makes you feel sharp, aware. I had planned to camp near a stream, but by late afternoon, clouds started rolling in. I wasn't worried about rain, but I figured I'd find some natural shelter just in case. That's when I saw it. It was tucked between the trees, barely visible from the trail. A one-room wooden cabin, old but intact, like something out of a history book. No signs of recent use. No smoke from a chimney, no stacked firewood, no path leading up to it. Just sitting there, waiting. I should have turned back. I should have camped by the stream like I planned. But curiosity got the better of me. The door wasn't locked. It creaked open under my touch, revealing dusty wooden floors, a single table and a few chairs, a small bed against the wall, blankets neatly folded but covered in dust, like they hadn't been touched in decades. No modern appliances, no electric lights, just a space frozen in time. My stomach clenched with something I couldn't name. Unease, maybe. But the wind was picking up outside, and I told myself I was being dramatic. It was shelter, that's all. I set my gear down and did a quick sweep of the place. No signs of animals getting in, no footprints in the dust. Just a single wood-burning stove in the corner and a small shelf with a few rusted cans of food. Everything about the cabin felt staged, like someone had left it set up perfectly and never returned. But the strangest part was the table. There were 2 plates sitting there, empty but placed across from each other, like someone had been about to sit down for dinner. Next to one of them was a notebook, old, its pages yellowed and brittle. I hesitated, but eventually I opened it. Most of it was nonsense. Disjointed sentences, pages filled with a single word written over and over. But one page in particular made my stomach drop. "It knows where you are." That was, do we see just that sentence written over and over for pages? My breath caught in my throat. I suddenly felt exposed, like I wasn't supposed to be here. My gut told me to leave, but the wind was howling outside now, rattling the walls of the cabin. I told myself it was just some old hermit's ramblings, nothing to be scared of. I had camped in worse places. I forced myself to shake it off, rolled out my sleeping bag on the floor, and turned off my lantern. But I didn't sleep. Not at first. Because sometime in the middle of the night I heard it. A knock at the door. It wasn't loud, just a single, sharp knock. Deliberate. I shot up, my breath caught in my throat, every nerve in my body on fire. I reached for my flashlight with shaking hands and pointed it at the door. No sound, no movement. Just the wind outside howling through the trees. My mind scrambled for an explanation. An animal? A tree branch? But knocking. That was human. I forced myself to stay still, listening. A minute passed. Then two. And just when I started convincing myself I had imagined it, another knock. Same as before. One single, deliberate tap. This time, it came from the wall behind me. I was done. My hands fumbled as I shoved my sleeping bag into my pack. I didn't care about the storm outside. I didn't care about the time. I needed to leave. I grabbed my gear and swung the door open and stopped cold. There, in the dirt just outside the cabin, were footprints. Fresh ones, leading to the door. But the thing that made my stomach drop? There were no footprints leading away. I ran. I didn't stop, didn't look back. I hiked through the dark, tripping over roots, branches clawing at my arms. My headlamp flickered, but I didn't slow down. I made it back to my car just as the sun started rising. I don't know what I expected to see when I looked back down the trail. Maybe a figure, maybe nothing at all. But the cabin, it wasn't there.